So beginning vegetable gardening. First, let me just say, if I mention trade names or specific products or specific retail establishments or anything like that, just understand that we are talking about things just for clarity. It's not an endorsement by myself nor the university on any of those things or similar or like things of disapproval. So just be aware of that. We don't do endorsements. So one thing I always like to encourage folks when you're doing your garden is to start on paper. I like you to do that for several reasons. And basically what it does, it lets you have a focus for your garden. It's very easy to get excited about the garden season and to have seed fever or anything else we might want to call it when the catalogs show up and you buy more than you can possibly use, or you commit to doing more than you can possibly take care of. So the challenge is always, what can we actually do in our garden? So that's why I like doing a plan on paper. It also means later, next year, it's going to give you the opportunity to have an easier job of what did I plant where, because we want to talk a little bit about rotations tonight, because rotating plant families can reduce disease problems. So it is a useful tool for us to have for later. And again, it doesn't really matter what your reason is for doing a gardening. You see some there listed on the screen. Your strategies to achieve that ultimate end goal in each one of those can be a little bit different. So no two gardens is exactly the same. And even for yourself, you may have different goals for different years. So don't think that you must always do the same thing. You don't have to. And certainly whatever your ultimate goal is, having it in mind when you begin makes it easier for you to be successful with it. And again, I like it. It helps me plan out what I'm going to do, whether it's raising my own transplants or actually buying things in, doesn't matter. It can be as sophisticated or as simple as you want. You know, a lot of people will kind of keep a garden diary or maybe a calendar that they keep a lot of information on. Great ideas. It gives you something to review back to, maybe change something you did, or if you did change something, what was the outcome on that? And so it can help you do things right or wrong again in the future. I do want to encourage people to be realistic about what you can manage. And so, you know, planting is only that first task. And sometimes it's very easy to get overly excited and have that overwhelm us at the end of the day. So for me, I don't want to forget, I've got to worry about things like weeding and taking care of insects and diseases. What about irrigation? Also looking at the task of harvesting. And if I'm going to do any sort of preserving, all of that comes along with the garden. And so if I recognize that at the beginning, I'm going to have probably a smaller garden, but maybe one that's better tended. In Tennessee, in our northeast corner, I would say by and large, Washington County itself is 7A. As we go around the region, we certainly get into zone 6. When you start looking at the immediate topography of where you live, if you're in the valley, it's going to be different than you're up on the mountainside. So 6 to 7 works. And really, this just kind of gives us an idea of where we're at. But what's neat about Tennessee, of course, is we do have that gradient across the state. West and south, we certainly are a lot warmer. And basically what this hardiness zone map is referencing is how cold does it get in winter on average or normally. And so certainly we did see at least down to the single digits and maybe below 0 in some areas back in December. So certainly, you know, 6B would not be stretching it at all for some of our locations. What we really want to be focused on when it comes to climate or weather and our gardens, it's really the frost events. That's what we're most concerned about. And so those frost events, the spring frost, which is actually the last frost of the frost season, for us is around May 10. It's not an exact science, but generally by May 10th, we are going to be frost free. There have been years and there will be years in the future when we are after that. and we still have a frost event. So it is not, unfortunately, a guarantee. There are some years our last frost is actually in April. What's good as you start getting towards, especially the 1st of May, you can look at the long range 10-day, 2-week forecast from whatever weather person you like. And lots of times they're right enough that we can see whether or not we're going to have those cold weather events happen. And so for us, the other thing to keep in mind when we talk about, when do we plant out our warm season crops, which is what we're worried about with our spring frost. Don't forget we're waiting for that soil to warm up. So even if we have air temperatures that aren't getting to freezing, it doesn't mean our soil temperatures are up high enough for those warm season crops. So I strongly encourage you not to plant things like tomatoes and peppers out at least before the 1st of May at the earliest, and really the 2nd week of May is probably a little bit better. It just gives time. And again, every season can be different. We can have warmer seasons that do allow us to be a little bit earlier. But by and large, May 10th is the date I shoot for warm season crops. In the fall, our first frost of the season, it can be anywhere from, middle of October, the 15th to around the 21st. 21st is probably a little bit generous. So we could probably dial that back a week and still be mostly on the money most years. But again, as we get in those later fall days, even if we don't have a frost, we're getting less light, temperatures are lower, and so we have less growth happening in the garden. But we have opportunities to do some great fall gardens in this area. If you've never done that, I want to encourage you to give that a try. And I'll probably have a class on that in July, and we'll talk at length about that. We can sometimes take advantage of protection if maybe we push the envelope a little too much. But again, the reality is, what's the soil temperature? And so where this is actually kind of a terraced bed, it's up out of the ground, it's going to warm up faster than it would in just a flat garden area. So that helps us maybe get things out a little bit earlier. That's one positive things about raised beds. But also the challenge is, just because we're using something like this floating row cover, that doesn't mean we're going to get away with it. So if we have the right type of frost event where we have cold front moves in and for several days it's cold, this is not going to change the outcome if we've got frost sensitive vegetables under there. So just be aware, this doesn't remove all the problems. It just hopefully gives us a little bit of buffer. It gives us a few degrees of protection, and hopefully that will allow us to have success. Most of the time, most folks I talk with, they're limited on space when it comes to a vegetable gardening. So it's worth mentioning, what are the highest or most expensive vegetables that you're buying if you go to the grocery store, and then what are most productive on a square foot basis? Because a lot of people are thinking about vegetable gardens from a cost savings perspective. And so if we're doing that, it makes sense to ask, what's the highest cost in the store and what's most productive for us? Luckily, those two lists are very similar. So we can grow a lot of things that are also high dollar at the store for us, so we get a lot of value for our efforts. One thing to be aware of is that if you notice on the right, that lists a lot of things that are on trellised or staked. So getting some vertical growing on these things really minimizes the amount of space they take in the garden. So that helps these be more productive per square foot, simply because by growing them up, we are limiting that ground area that they're taking. So there are other benefits for garden other than just the financial side of it. One of those is just the physical and mental well-being. So being outside, having activities, doing those sorts of things is positive for our physical and mental health. There's even a whole bent to horticulture called horticulture therapy, where it uses gardening and other activities specifically as a therapy for individuals. Then another thing I like about it, if you enjoy cooking, growing your own allows you to have unmatched variety. So for instance, there are actually stuffing tomatoes that the way they grow, they're essentially hollow inside. And so they're great if you want to stuff a tomato like a pepper. I don't think you're going to find one of those at a grocery store, but you can grow them in your own garden. The other thing is, when we grow our own vegetables, studies show us we're more likely to eat them. That picture there is actually from one of our school gardens, and we do a nutrition and gardening program with a number of schools in the county. And The whole point of it is we have them gardening because kids are more likely to try something when they're growing. So if you have a picky eater and you have a garden, that can be one way to help encourage them to try something when they're actually eating their own produce. And certainly I think that holds even for us. When it's more available to us, we're more likely to choose it. And very few of us need to eat less vegetables. When we talk about finding a location for our garden, where do we put it? You always see the phrase full sun. Well, what in the world does that mean? Really, we're talking 6 to 8 hours of sun. More is better. So if you have very open, very sunny spots, that's good. It's not going to be a negative thing. We do want to be careful sometimes that we don't put like raised beds necessarily on a concrete driveway or something like that in full sun, because we may roast them. But other than that, the more sun, the better. We want to try to avoid trees. And so it's more than one reason. Obviously, shade. Plants need as full of sunlight as possible, but also root competition if we're growing in the ground. So especially in dry seasons, you're going to notice the trees are really good at competing. Even in our lawns, when we have a dry year, you'll notice the grass closer to the trees is generally worse off. So we don't want our vegetables to be competing with trees for nutrients or for water. And so the further we can be away from those trees, the better. Again, we all have the limitations of what we have available to us. The other thing we need is well-drained soils. And so we don't need to be technical about this. Very simply, if the ground is very squishy, we can know after a rain, we can know that ground is probably not well drained. If water is standing there, it's not well drained. If you don't want to take your mower across it after it rained because you know you'll leave ruts, it's not well drained. All of those are basically saying the water sits there. It doesn't go away quickly. And that is a challenge because roots have to have oxygen. And so because of that, we don't want to necessarily plant plants there. Or we want to select plants that can do well, and that's not going to be vegetables. So there's plenty of trees, for instance, we can plant in wet areas that will like it, but not our vegetable gardens. The other thing to consider is we can use raised beds or containers. So this may let you put some plants where you might not otherwise, and that's good. And so there's a lot of newer varieties that are either bush type or miniatures or things like that. So we can fit a lot of vegetables in smaller containers. Don't put too large of things in containers. So, you know, if you're going to plant a tomato in a container, go with a large container, like maybe a 5-gallon bucket, and still try to pick a bush tomato or maybe even one of the miniature tomatoes. It's going to be better suited. We do want to size our plants in containers for success. We want to avoid planting a garden on a septic drain field. Obviously, sometimes with home sites, we're limited, especially if we don't have the best draining soils, but we don't want to be planting where we have a septic drain field. If everything worked perfectly, in theory, it's not a concern, but we know sometimes things don't work perfectly with septic drain fields. We would love to have level areas, but if you've noticed in East Tennessee, that doesn't always happen. Or if it does happen, it's not the native soil, it's something that was brought in that you're not sure you can grow a rock in it. So we are often utilizing slopes, and that's not a bad thing, but we do want to be more careful about erosion, because when we add in slopes to bare soil, we increase the risk of erosion. Be aware of that. Think about how we're not going to have bare soil there, whether we're using an organic mulch on that surface or whether we're utilizing things like green manures, cover crops, things of that nature. Another thing I really want to encourage you is to consider your water source where you're placing your garden. I almost think it's a necessity simply because virtually every season I've ever been a gardener or around a garden, there was some point in time in that season where it was beneficial to have irrigation or water available to those crops. It doesn't mean we're using it all season long. Certainly there are years where it's just a short period where we may have a dry spell, but having water is going to get you the greatest possibility of return for that garden. In some years, I will say it is a necessity. We can have drought years where it's hot and dry, and if you're not able to provide water to these plants, your results are going to be very meager. And that may be okay, but just understand that limitation if you don't have water irrigation available. Another thing sometimes I run into is people will have maybe a piece of property out in the county, or maybe they'll be growing on their parents' or their grandparents' farm. Nothing wrong with that, but the fact is, the closer to home it is, the more likely you are to do what needs to happen in that garden. And so that means if you have it in the backyard, you'll probably do more with it, and you'll probably get a better result. And who's going to yell at all the deer trying to eat everything if you have it away from your house? If we take a moment to talk about soils, this is kind of the magical, mythical soil that probably doesn't exist anywhere except on paper. But basically what it's telling us is our soils are about 50% open area, pore space, and about 50% solid stuff. Most of that small solid stuff we have no control over. It's parent material. It's the bedrock. It's material that was moved in by glaciers or moved in by rivers, or whatever the case may be. That other 5% of stuff, that's organic matter. So that's both living and dead organic matter. We do have some influence on that. We can increase it or decrease it based on our efforts. We want to increase it. So we want to see organic matter go up. So anytime we can do something that improves or preserves organic matter, we should with our garden soils. And what's important about that 50%, pore space is where we hold air and water. So roots have to have oxygen, and they also have to have water. And so if we are causing compaction in our soils where we don't have enough pore space there for both, that means when it's wet, we're excluding oxygen. Basically, we can kill our roots off. So we always want to avoid things that would cause compaction and reduce the pore space area in our soils. And we'll talk a little bit about how we might do that. I do think a soil test is worthwhile if you've never done one for your garden area. It's not something you need to do frequently. Every 3 to 5 years is sufficient. But what it does, it measures basically the nutrients that are present in your soil. And it gives us some idea of where we need to go with fertility. So you're not spending money on fertilizer that's not needed. You're not utilizing lime if it's not needed. And so we do offer this through our office. We send them off to the University of Tennessee Soil Lab. They do all the work. It's $20 per test. It's $15 for the processing of the test. And then we charge $5 for shipping. And so I encourage you to do that. We do not make money on those, by the way. If we send one test by itself, it will cost us $10. I know that because I did that last week. So we do our best to try to hold those till we have several, so we can at least break even on the shipping. If we don't have soil tests available to us, there are some things that we do. Typically, we just then focus on nitrogen application with fertilizers, because nitrogen is typically typically is the most limiting nutrient in availability to our plants. And so a good rule of thumb we can apply as a pre-plant fertilizer is about 2 pounds of actual nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. So you may be wondering, what in the world does he mean by actual nitrogen? So any fertilizer product is not 100% of whatever. And so here we have a label on a fertilizer, and it is a fake fertilizer, so please don't go to the store and ask for it. But let's say it was a fertilizer that was a 20-21-22. So what that tells us is it's 20% nitrogen, 21% phosphorus, and 22% potassium. And we actually have the phosphorus and potassium represented as oxides, because back in the day, that's the way they did it. It was cool to burn stuff and measure it, and they stuck with it. But it's just think of it as phosphorus, think of it as potassium. Potassium is also known as potash. So that may be a phrase you're more familiar with that. But basically what this is telling us, if I want to apply 2 pounds per 1,000 square feet, then I need to apply 10 pounds of that fertilizer to get the 2 pounds of actual nitrogen, because only 20% of the fertilizer is actually nitrogen. So 20% of that weight I apply is the nitrogen content. So that's how you look at actual nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium. Look at the percentage in the product and then divide or multiply to get the actual rate of fertilizer product that you use. And it changes depending on what fertilizer you use. We do also want to bring to your attention side dressing or in-season fertilization. Particularly with nitrogen, we do not want to put everything down that that plant could possibly use at the beginning of the season, because we will lose it. It can turn into nitrogen gas. It can be lost with water moving it away. And so we don't put everything down at the beginning. So side dressing, there's a table in this publication, Getting the Most Out of Your Home Vegetable Garden Soil Test Report. Even if you don't have a soil test to look at, still worth looking at because of this table. This is just a small chunk of it. But for instance, with tomatoes, we would actually want to come in and side dress them when we start having fruits 1 inch in diameter. And again, this is just ensuring that the plant is going to have everything it needs, because fertilization obviously gives us a better yield. It gives us more of a crop, which is good, but it's also about keeping that plant as healthy as possible. And so healthy plants are better able to resist pests, whether it's insects or diseases. So we do want to use fertilizer. Sometimes with home gardens, I kind of see two extremes. Either people go to where they don't want to do anything with fertility, they don't apply much, or they go way over the top and really sock it to it. And really, both of them are not good plans. We want to be in that medium where we're applying what the plant needs, making that available, but not using an excess nor being deficient in what the plant needs. And so that's where utilizing the rule of thumbs, if we don't have a soil test, and honestly, a soil test every 5 years will probably save us more than the cost of over applied fertilizer. So I encourage folks to give a shot at looking at soil tests. Well, what about lime? So first, what we need to do is understand lime and sulfur affect pH, and pH is basically a chemical characteristic of the soil. And we'll talk about why it's important in just a second. Lime raises the pH or make it more alkaline. Sometimes people will say it makes the soil sweeter. Sulfur, and that's elemental sulfur, is used to lower pH or make it more acidic. Generally, we would use that, for instance, like with blueberries. Now, blueberries would love to be around 5 on the pH scale. Most of our gardens should be about 6.5. So sometimes we do find we want to make the soil more acidic. What I want to stress to you is lime is not a fertilizer. And so I have multiple times in more than one state run into folks who lime their soils every year, because that's what you do to a garden. You don't want to do that to your garden, because then we get a soil test back with a pH of 7.2, and we want to be at 6.5. So we can absolutely overlime soils and have very bad results in the garden. So do not ever apply lime unless you have a soil test telling you to use lime and how much to use. Because even if your soil needs it, how much does it need without knowing that pH value to begin with? Fact is, we don't know. I can't tell you. Nobody's going to be able to accurately tell you what you need to apply. So that's why we never use lime or sulfur without a soil test. Just to emphasize, don't use it without a soil test. The reason we talk about pH is because it's about nutrient availability. And so what this picture represents is soil pH across the bottom. And then we have the bands of different nutrients that plants are needing. And the width of that band is how much it is available. So the broader the band, the more available it is. The more narrow it is, the less available. And you can see the ideal pH of 6.5, almost every nutrient is almost at its most available. And so that's why 6.5. And generally we say gardens, anywhere from 6 to 7 is fine. We're not going to suggest any adjustment if you're in that range. If you go above 7, we're going to try to do things to get that down. Maybe look at fertilizers that are more acid forming, because some fertilizers do cause more acidic conditions, or even looking at possibly elemental sulfur. If we're going below 6, we may start looking at utilizing lime. Of course, if we're wanting to do something like blueberries, we'll be looking at using elemental sulfur to try to get that down to about 5 if we can, because that's where they're going to be the happiest. So it can vary depending on the very specific crop. Potatoes, for instance, can generally tolerate more acidic conditions than most vegetables. But again, if you're 6 to 7 on a pH in your garden soil, and I will say this, I know there's a lot of pH strips and meters and things like that out there. I have never seen any of those that are reliable. You know, the meters and things like that, my first question would be, well, how do you calibrate it? If it doesn't come with calibration instructions and you're trying to measure something like pH, I don't think it's a useful tool. I don't think it's going to be accurate. So again, I wouldn't go that route for measuring these. I'd look at utilizing a soil testing lab, whether it's our universities or there are private labs as well. Those that are doing it are going to do it accurately. One question I get a lot in this area is, I've got clay soils, what can I do? Well, first off, clay soils are not a terrible thing. So all the big trees we have around here and all the mountains that are covered, there's clay in there. So clay in and of itself is not a bad thing. What happens is, what do we do with it and how do we manage it that makes it bad at the end of the day? So what we always want to do is try to add organic matter to clay soils. So what is organic matter? Basically, it was something that was living or something that came out of something living. So it's things like compost, it's things like plant debris, whether we're talking leaves, lawn clippings, wood chips, manures and beddings. All of those are organic matter products. And we can use those to add organic matter to our soils. Because remember earlier I said, we always want to try to increase the organic matter content if we can. There are some caveats with this because there's a few danger points. There are herbicides that will survive passing through the digestive system of animals. So picloram, aminoclopyrids, various other ones. If you don't know specifically what was utilized on the pastures that the animals were on or on the hay that they're feeding on, don't use the manure until you've done at least a bioassay test. And basically that's, I don't have that on the links right now. Let me add that. Let me make a note to myself. Basically, you can grow something like green beans, which are extremely sensitive to these herbicides, grow them up to about the 4-leaf stage. Use the like compost, for instance, as a medium to grow them in. And if it has a problem, you'll see deformed leaves, wrinkled leaves, crinkled leaves. When you see this in the gardens, typically tomatoes and green beans are the ones that are affected. There'll be other things that are perfectly fine. But I have seen over the past several seasons, more than one garden that has used composted manures or animal bedding, and it did have these herbicides in it, and it did cause problems. And the real challenge is these herbicides are not going to go away quickly. And even composting it, in fact, may make them stick around longer because the way organic matter can hang on to things. So if you're utilizing composts that have animal manures in it or animal bedding, or if you're using animal bedding and manures themselves, be aware of those herbicide cautions, ask questions. If you can't get definitive answers, be cautious. Lawn clippings, it's kind of the same thing. We can have some carryover with herbicides, so just be aware of that. Wood chips, if we use those as an organic matter, don't incorporate those because they're a large amount of carbon. As a surface mulch, not a big deal, because sometimes people are concerned about using carbon-rich materials in the garden because they'll tell you, well, it binds up nitrogen. What really happens is you've got the microbe community there that want both carbon and nitrogen. If we throw a ton of carbon out there, they'll grab every available nitrogen as well because they're using both of them for fuel, for building blocks for themselves to replicate. And so basically, if you provide an excess of one, it depletes the other. And so what we actually want to do, if we are incorporating a lot of organic matter is potentially that's high in carbon, we want to add additional nitrogen fertility or fertilizer there to offset that, so it is plant available, because it doesn't disappear on us, but we don't get that nitrogen back until the microbes die or they're eaten by something higher order than them. And so because of that, We want to be careful how we use something like wood chips, so don't incorporate it. Sulfur mulch is fine. It works well. We can also grow cover crops. This is one we don't necessarily do a lot in the home garden. I think we probably should do it more. So whether over winter or if we have enough area where we can have areas with summer cover crops on them. Growing living plants is great for our soil. It's literally the best thing we can be doing. And so then we can turn those unders. You'll sometimes hear these referred to as green manure crops. A great strategy to add organic matter. Another thing I always scratch my head about is there's a lot of people that rake leaves or blow leaves. If you're moving leaves on your property and you have a vegetable garden, blow them into the garden, pile them up in the garden. By spring, they'll be mostly gone. You'll be surprised how quickly they'll go away. Even if they were to still be there, they're not bad as a mulch. So you can pull them back, open that bare soil up so it warms up a little faster in the spring and just plant right into them. So leaves are great to add to your garden if you're going to be moving them anyway. We add organic matter because it's almost like this magical stuff to our soils. It creates good soil structure, which improves air and water infiltration. Because remember, I said we want to have good pore space. We want to have air and water available to our roots. This actually helps. You've got bacteria in there. They're basically producing glues. You've got funguses that are producing, strands that are binding things together. So adding organic matter is great for our microbes. It itself is actually a source of nutrients as it breaks down, as it goes through the whole cycle down there with all the micro biologicals that are in your soil. It also retains nutrients. So I always think of not only is organic matter adding nutrients to the soil, but it's almost like putting shelving units in there as well, because it's actually able to hold on to nutrients. So you actually retain nutrients better with higher organic matter. It also increases the water holding capacity of our soils. So more water in our soils means greater drought tolerance. That means watering less frequently. And so it basically means a better outcome for our garden. So we always want to add organic matter. What we don't want to add to clay soils is sand. Sometimes people think, well, sand is so free draining. I'll add that to my clay soils and I'll have a freer draining soil. Unfortunately, no. If you add sand and clay, you basically get bricks, because what happens is sand particles relative to clay are very large. So it would be like having a bucket of basketballs and then throwing BBs in between it. That bucket's going to get a lot heavier because the little clay particles will fit in between the sand particles. And so you don't improve pore space, or you actually decrease it. You're increasing the bulk density of that soil, making it denser, or you're removing pore space. So never add sand in an effort to improve a clay soil. You'll do exactly the opposite of what you hope. Tillage is a tool we can use in our gardens. It is a little bit of a double-edged sword. It's not all positive, but it is a useful tool, especially when we're talking about establishing gardens to begin with. It can be a great labor saver. Doing things by hand, it's possible, but if you've ever tried to double dig a bed, you quickly learn why that's the way they used to do it. It's not a great vacation time spent for sure. Oftentimes it is good to remove sod. If you've got nice healthy grass growing there, it's vigorous. Sometimes it can be a challenge to get it worked under well, especially by hand, definitely, but even with tillage implements, sometimes we can have grass coming back up. Not the worst weed to have, certainly, but sometimes cutting that off the top can be good. You can throw it over, let it basically kind of compost. So I wouldn't get rid of it per se, but certainly it is something that is helpful to actually go ahead and get out of the area at times. We can also use tillage to incorporate amendments. So if we're adding in lime, if the soil test told us, fertilizers, compost, or other organic amendments, we can do that with tillage, and that's not a bad thing to do. That being said, tillage is also cautionary for us. So one of the things, it can actually lead to compaction. because one, we're chopping everything up fine. And so we want to form aggregates in our soil, which are basically, it's not clumps per se, but essentially that's what it is. And why we want to do that is when we have aggregation happening with soils, we are increasing pathways for water and air to get into our soils. And again, there's a whole complex way it happens, but basically bacteria are really good at producing basically glues that helps particles stick together. Fungi are binding things together with their mycelium threads. And so when we have healthy biological communities in our soil, we start seeing this aggregation form. And what happens is when we till, we chop everything up real fine. And so believe it or not, it's not the best thing in the world to till. The other thing we run into, weed seeds. All of our soils have weed seeds in them. Weed seeds are going to stay there dormant. That's one of the worst things about them. Most of the seeds, or a lot of the seeds we use in our gardens, particularly vegetables, if you plant out 100 seeds, all of them are going to germinate this season. They're not going to wait around. Do that with weed seeds, some percentage is going to germinate. Some of them are just going to sit there. And because of that, every time we're tilling and we're bringing up new soil, we're bringing up a whole new batch of weeds, as well as burying last year's weed seeds deeper in the soil so they can wait around for us. So although we can certainly use tillage to control weeds, it can also just kind of be a circular thing. So no till is not a bad plan. Another thing to consider is when we chop up that soil, we're literally chopping up organic matter into smaller pieces. If you remember back to high school chemistry, anytime you increase surface area, you increase basically the chemical or biological reactions associated with it. It's like trying to burn a 2x4 or trying to burn a toothpick. Toothpick's easier to burn because relative to the 2x4, it has more surface area. And so it burns faster. Same thing, chemical reactions that are happening in the soil. As we have smaller pieces, they're going to be acted on more quickly by that microbiological community, and it's going to get lost faster. So we literally burn up our organic matter faster, and we want to preserve it or increase it. So again, it's not that we can't use tillage, but just understand the negative sides of it. The other thing that can happen too is basically, especially with rototillers and really any tillage we use, there's kind of a fixed depth that they'll go to, or at least a maximum. And when we're doing that year after year after year, we actually have a normal force or a downward force from that equipment on the soil below it. So we can get what's called a plow pan, which is a compacted layer of soil, 8 or 10 inches below the ground. And that can hold water and lead to waterlogging and things like that. So tillage is useful. It's a tool we can use, but it's not something we probably should use all the time in our garden. And that sometimes is a little bit of a change for us. If we do till, we want to be careful not to till when the soil is too wet. So basically take a bunch of the soil in your hands, make a ball. If you stick your finger in it and it falls apart, you're good to go. If you stick your finger in it and the ball of soil doesn't fall apart, it's too wet. And if you till when it's too wet, you're going to end up with clods, so chunks of soil. And I don't care if you wait till it dries out and come back and till it 3 more times, all you'll do is break the clods up to little smaller clods. It will never be good. And so it'll be like you're trying to plant plants with gravel. And so, you'll have some plants that just never take off, never do well. I've seen this happen in fields on a commercial level. And sometimes when things get worked, when it's too wet, it just causes a lot of loss because the plants basically don't have a nice soil environment for their roots to go into. So they're always kind of stunted. So do be careful when you till. What to plant? That's the good thing. It comes down to that variety. So obviously you want to plant what you'll actually eat. Don't plant a lot of stuff you're not going to eat yourself because you're doing the labor and you should get most of the reward. But I do think the opportunity that presents to us with gardens, the ability to plant something different. So this is Romanesco broccoli. You've probably seen broccoli. I've never seen this in the store, but it is something you can grow in your home garden. It's probably still broccoli, so I'm not saying your kids will eat it, but, or maybe if you put enough cheese on it, they'll eat it. But at the end of the day, you can grow different things. Or, instead of growing the heading broccolis, what about broccoli raw, the non-heading broccolis? Or we have, cauliflowers that are yellow and purple in addition to white. Cauliflower can be challenging to grow, but, certainly things like that. The bottom one there is a kiwano or a jelly melon. I don't know if any of you have ever grown those. They're actually super easy to grow. I have grown them. What's neat is, especially like back in the 90s and stuff, you'd see those pop up on a lot of science fiction shows and things because they look so weird. So, if you're in a galaxy far, far away and you need a weird fruit, kiwanos fit it. But again, very interesting. Not bothered much by disease or insects in my experience. Not saying that they taste great or they're going to be your new favorite thing in the garden, but again, it's something different. It's something unusual. How much should you grow? So I have in the resources what I call Vegetables 101. It's a document that actually has pulled out information of some previous versions of some of our documents. And so the reason I pulled it out and saved it is because it actually has some estimates about yield per 100-foot row. Now, there's always a huge caveat with this. On some of these, you can see like a range from 75 to 150 pounds. That's a heck of a big range when you really get down to the brass tacks of it. So I would not say, that this is a good guess. It doesn't mean you couldn't be above this with great management and good varieties and a good growing season. You could also be below it if it's a tough year, but at least gives you a reference point to consider and start with. And again, so I'm not saying this is, if you absolutely plant 100 feet, then it must fall in this range, but at least gives you a reference point to consider if you are thinking about, hey, I'd like to eat this, X number of times a week. And so you kind of reference, if you look at some of the canning materials, you can actually find where they talk about, to get X number of quarts of tomatoes, you need this many pounds. And so that can kind of give you a plan if you think, well, we use a few quarts a week. And so if I want to preserve, then you can do some math and actually have a keyed in plan on what you're planting instead of planting something and hoping that it's about right. So it's good information if you've not gardened before. The other thing I would say, and I think it's the next, well, we'll get to it in a minute. There's other resources to use too that are good for that. One I really enjoy because I think it presents it in a good, timely fashion is actually our garden calendar we put out. And so this is available online. It does cover the entire state. So as you read through months, you will see it talks about West, Middle, and East Tennessee. And again, the recommendations are timely. And so it talks about looking at doing different tasks based on when's the time to do it. So very useful. It's got good information, above the month. It has little interesting things, including links to other resources through UT. It's useful. And so I hope you find that to be something you use. One thing that's worth talking about for home gardens is growing transplants. So there are some reasons I think to do this. The biggest one comes back for me to variety. I can grow what I want. And so, if you look at some of the heirloom or open pollinated varieties in some catalogs, there are just so many choices. Pick your country, pick the shape, pick the color, whatever. And so you're never going to find all those, even though we've got some good resources around here, some farms that grow heirloom varieties, transplants, and things like that. There's just so many out there. You're not necessarily going to find the one you really want. And so basically, when we use transplants in the garden, we can get harvest earlier because basically we're starting out with a plant that's already been growing for a few weeks. And so it is useful, but that doesn't mean we have to. Certainly, there's a lot of things we can sow directly in the ground and some things that may even be beneficial to do that over a transplant. But whenever we're growing indoors, just understand very rarely are you going to have enough ambient light coming through windows. Even if it's a bay window, even if it's south facing, it's still going to be a challenge. So supplemental lighting is highly encouraged. It doesn't have to be some sort of super duper setup. We're not growing something that looks like Japanese maple in a closet. So some of you got that. So we don't need a super duper setup, but even just fluorescent shop lights will supplement and do well. And so, you know, I've got some more information on this. I actually did a class, I think 2 years ago. So there's actually a recording on our YouTube channel if you want to look at growing transplants that goes more in depth. One of the biggest things is do go ahead probably and sow more than one seed per cell or per small container, but then come back and thin to the strongest. So, you know, don't let seedlings be crowded. I'd rather have one good plant than 3 half stunted ones by the time we're done. A big thing that we run into, people keep them too wet. When they're smaller, they're going to use less water than they're bigger. So you don't necessarily have to keep the whole soil volume wet all the time. And don't forget to harden plants off. And that's just exposing them to the outside conditions of brighter light and different humidity and temperature changes, and doing that a few weeks before. And that's a gradual process. We don't want to take our transplants and stick them directly out into the garden because we can quite literally sunburn them when we do that. One thing that is beneficial to do, and that's why I took up a whole slide with this picture, is you can always upsize when you've got transplants. So rather than keep them in very small containers, if you've got limited space, especially when you're starting, you can start them in a smaller, more densely grown container or like this, a cell pack or tray. And then as they outgrow that space, move them up into a larger size. There's nothing wrong with that. And in fact, growing like this in size of containers actually can be a little bit easier to manage water. When you put a small plant in very large containers, sometimes we can waterlog them. It can be a challenge sometimes. So it's not a bad idea to grow in container size as the plant grows. If we're buying transplants, and there's certainly nothing wrong with buying transplants, but I want to encourage you to take a look at the roots, because the roots are probably the most important thing. And lots of times nobody looks at them. So if I'm ever at a store or a garden center and they're mad about me popping something out of a cell pack or even a plant out of a 1 gallon container, they're not satisfied with me doing that, I'll take my business somewhere else. It'd be like buying a car, but not actually ever test driving it. You're just looking at the outside. So we want white roots, healthy roots. This is actually a marigold picture I had. But again, white healthy roots is what we're looking for, well-formed, filling up the volume, but not overly root bound. Now, a lot of things, marigolds are one, they don't care if they're root bound, just cut the roots apart, it'll be fine. But why have a root bound plant if we don't have to? So looking at plants that are properly sized in their containers, not overgrowing it, is good. If we do have matted roots, starting to get root bound, we can tear those apart, cut those apart, tease them out gently. I don't really think normally it makes a huge difference with method you choose on that. We'll say cucurbits are one that transplants. I want you to be gentle with them. They aren't the easiest things to transplant well. There's probably only moderate benefits to using a transplant as opposed to direct seeding those in our garden. But if you're going to use a transplant, make sure that you do handle their root systems gently. Another thing to keep in mind, with one exception, we want to plant transplants at the same depth they were growing in the container. And so we don't want to bury them too deeply. Tomatoes, we can bury deeper because they will set roots along their stems. But you also don't want to use a post hole digger to plant your tomatoes. And I have seen people on the internet, I plant my post, it's like, no, because your roots need oxygen, and the vast majority of your roots are going to be in the top 12 inches of the soil, no matter what you do. And it's just the function of how deeply can oxygen get in the soil. And yes, roots can go further, but majority are going to be in the top 12 inches. And so if we're planting an overgrown, leggy, tall tomato plant really super deep, it's probably going to survive because of its ability to produce roots up and down that stem. But those very bottom roots probably aren't going to do a whole lot if they're really deep in the soil. And so I encourage you not to do that. Again, I'd rather have a small, actively growing transplant than a big one. The only difference between large transplants and small transplants is basically their age. So yes, an older plant will get you fruit faster out there in the garden, but it doesn't mean the yield's going to be any better. It's just an older plant. It got started earlier. So I like small transplants. I mentioned earlier about talking about another source of information. Strongly encourage you to read the seed packet. There's great information on there. And sometimes it can be very specific to varieties. So a couple of years ago when I was doing a gardening talk, I had a couple of different pea packets, and I was going to show how our guide was matching up to the packet of peas, and it did not match up at all when it came to spacing. It's like, well, darn. But the reason it didn't is because the packet I had actually happened to be a tendril type pea. So it doesn't grow a typical vine. It just grows pea tendrils instead of growing leaves and everything, which is great if you want pea tendrils for salads, for instance. You'd want to grow that variety versus the other kinds. But the spacing is totally different because it doesn't have leaves like the others. So the specific information to that variety was on that packet. It was absolutely correct. And so I strongly encourage you to look at the packets. They're going to give you the best advice on spacing because it's variety specific. Even our guides that are research-based cannot fully address all the complexity that's out there based on the different varieties of plants. So packets have great information. If you are direct sowing, or even if you're sowing for transplants, don't put the seed too deeply. A general rule of thumb is basically you plant seeds at twice their width. A lot of seeds are very small, and even the longest measurement, you're still going to be under half an inch. So don't plant seeds too deeply, because think about, they've got to start growing up and pushing up those cotyledons, those seed leaves above the ground. And so if you plant them too deeply, they basically don't have enough energy reserves to do that, and they die. So don't plant them too deeply. There are some seeds, not so much vegetables I can think of off the top of my head, but some different plants that do require light exposure to germinate. So we don't want to bury them much at all. In fact, we basically just want to sow them on top of the surface and just kind of press them in there. But again, seed packets are a great place to find out if you're planting something that has that light requirement. Buy fresh seeds, but let me put a huge asterisk or several on this, because if you take your leftover seeds once you're done sowing out in the garden or sowing your transplant flats or whatever and put it in the freezer, those seeds for most vegetables are going to last for years with great germination. Tomato seeds easily, no exaggeration, you can be pulling seeds out of there for 10 years and they still work. I've done it. Because again, what happens is seeds are living. We don't think of them as doing that, but they're basically living. And so when we keep them in the freezer, they basically don't burn through their energy reserves. When we keep them at a higher temperature, they do it at a higher rate. The warmer it is, the faster it happens. So I would say freezer. A refrigerator is good. I'd say a freezer is better. When we think about all the long-term like seed vaults that are out there, germplasm resources, they're all using liquid nitrogen. Frozen. Yeah. We don't have access to that, or some of us probably shouldn't have access, maybe myself included. I might play with it too much, but at the end of the day, just keeping it in the freezer is going to preserve the life of those seeds tremendously. And so that means don't feel like you have to plant 27 tomatoes in one variety. Plant a few from one variety and a few from another, and that way you have diversity out there in the garden just for the fun of it. And so you do not have to use up that packet of seeds. There's a few exceptions. Onions are one that don't store well or have a great life. Parsnips, I believe, is another. Those are two that come to my mind. And there may be some others, but vast majority of our seed, even if you just keep it 2 or 3 years, you will still have good germination. The absolute worst case scenario is germination goes down. So if you put 3 seeds in a cell as it gets older and only one comes up, you're okay. So that's the bad outcome of if seeds are getting a little too old, they just simply don't germinate as well. We also don't want to plant into media that's too wet. I didn't say soil, because if we're doing transplants, we don't want to use soil from the garden. We do want to buy a potting media or potting soil that doesn't have any soil in it at all. But we also want it to be damp, not soaking wet. when we're covering seeds, whether direct sowing or transplanting, generally speaking, we're covering them with soil lightly, and then we're either tamping them down or pressing them in because we need good solid contact between the seed and the soil to initiate water uptake and eventually germination. So we have to have good seed to soil contact. And so firming up over top of seeds after you plant them. Large, strong seeds, you probably step on the ground if we're talking something like beans, for instance, but smaller things, just using our hand, just to press on the soil well, does a good job. It's worthwhile to try to plant in straight rows when we're in the garden because it does make other tasks easier. So if we're going to do physical weed control, like with a hoe or things like that, it really helps to have things as straight as possible. It also means it's easier to find seedlings when they're first starting to come up. And so we don't misidentify them and maybe pull out something we wish we had. So for a lot of home gardeners, I see a push going towards intensive gardening. And all this is just growing more in less space. One of the probably most famous approaches to this is square foot gardening. It works great. There's nothing wrong with it. But basically, it's just kind of getting more out of the space that you have available to you. And so to that end, we'll talk a little bit about some different strategies we can approach this. One of these is wide row planting. And so often in gardens, we see a row of plant and then a pathway, and then a row of plants and then a pathway. You don't have to do that. You can actually group 2 to 3 rows of plants together and then have a pathway. And so what this does is basically you're using less ground for that pathway. And so that means that you are maximizing more plants in your square footage. And so, for instance, this was actually a farm that I know that was doing kale. And basically he has kale 2 rows planted. And you can see at maturity, you basically don't even see the ground. And that's kind of the goal with planting with wide rows is at maturity, they're pretty much touching each other. They've maximized the space. And whenever we do that, it's actually a great way to control weeds. If we don't have sunlight reaching the soil, we have way fewer seeds germinating from weeds. So actually having good soil coverage like this helps us in that way. And again, depending on the exact vegetable, spacing is going to vary. There's a lot of commercial vegetable production that happens with, for instance, like twin rows, where they'll be staggered next to each other. And again, it's just a way to maximize the number of plants you can get into a given field. Raised beds are great, but they're not essential to success. And so I want to stress that. Sometimes when you read or come across some things about raised beds, they're almost called out as an essential gardening tool. They work fine, but you can perfectly grow great vegetables just growing in the ground. What's great about them is if you have some physical limitations, they can make it easier because you're not having to stoop as low. There are even strategies to bring beds up and elevate them, make them accessible for an individual in a wheelchair, for instance. So there's nothing wrong with them, and there's definitely some cases when we should use them. It can allow us to intensively change the soil or improve it because we're basically having to fill up a box. And so depending what we choose to fill it with, we can improve conditions. There may be scenarios where maybe we're not making such great improvements too. And that's one of their challenges is the cost of it. What does it cost to fill it? Are you going to fill it with dirt from on site, which is okay, maybe even preferred in a lot of instances, or are you going to buy something and fill it up with? That can become expensive. Oftentimes, a lot of people do this because they like the aesthetics of it. So it can match your deck, or you can use stone or brick or something that's already in the physical landscape. And so they work great as part of the landscape and not just as a garden. The one thing I do want to stress on these is typically we'll be watering a raised bed more frequently than if we had the same vegetables in the ground. Raised beds are more exposed to sunlight as well as wind. And because of that, they actually burn through more water. And also gravity has a greater effect of water on the soil and pulls it through more. So because of that, it's good if you have poorly draining soils, but it also means you're going to be watering more frequently. So just be aware that I would not use a raised bed if I did not have the ability to water it. Intercropping is another strategy we can use to maximize our space. And basically it is just planting different vegetables side by side to take advantage of different maturity lengths with those vegetables. And so that means, a classic example of this is the Three Sisters from the Native American gardening, where you have corn seeds sown out. Once those plants begin to grow and get up, you plant out bean seeds, which then run on the corn plants for support. And then you can also plant out squash in between the rows, which help to shade out weeds. So you've got those three sisters growing there. So that is one idea of this. Another is just, let's say it's a spring garden, because we do kind of really have three gardens in this area. We have a spring cool garden, we have a warm season garden, and then we have a fall garden. And so if you're doing a spring garden, you can, for instance, be planting radishes in between cabbage transplants, because you will have those radishes out of there 30, 35 days, depending on what variety you pick, some maybe even a little bit faster. So before they are ever overgrown by those cabbage transplants, you can use that area for something like radishes or leaf lettuces or something like that. And there's 100 different possibilities with this. And so there's definitely a useful strategy to maximize your space and just basically grow more than one crop in the same space. Another one that is important, I think, for home gardeners is succession planting. So basically all this is having multiple plantings throughout the season of the same thing. So most of our vegetables have a peak harvest period. So, they'll start maturing and then they start slowing down. So it's kind of like a bell curve. They start slowly, they speed up, and then they slow down. By planting multiple times in the garden, so by planting every 2 weeks, for instance, or every 3 weeks, we can basically extend that peak harvest period over a longer period of time, because we're extending the harvest by planting multiple times. We can also pick multiple varieties of a crop that have different maturity dates. So we can plant all at the same time, but because they have different maturity dates, like early, mid, and late, we can actually have 3 different peaks of harvest. So for instance, if you were wanting to plant just to eat fresh out of your garden, you might only plant a few plants of something at a time, because once that starts to slow down, you have the next few plants coming on. On the other hand, if your goal is for preservation out of the garden, like canning, freezing, or something like that, and you prefer just to, have a weekend or a couple of days where you just knock out the canning. And so you want the vast majority of your tomatoes to come in that period where you can tackle it, then you would plant everything all at once, because you want that peak to all happen at the same time. So there's no right or wrong way if you do this or don't do this, but this can help you have success, because it's great if you have, green beans for several weeks, and that might be all you want. But if you want green beans for a longer period of time, having those multiple plantings, as well as having different varieties, can stretch that period of harvest. The other thing we can do with succession planting is, as soon as one crop is done, we put the second in, or a third in, or a fourth in, as the case may be. And so that's what happens with square foot gardening. And one thing I do want to stress about these intensive methods, we're putting more plants in the same given area. And so that means we've got to have more resources there than we would otherwise. So the more densely we plant, the more fertility we need there to support those plants, the more water we need available. So just understand, when we put more in less space, we are ramping up the demands that they have for nutrition and water. And again, healthy plants are better plants because they better resist diseases. Another thing we can do, I mentioned it earlier when we were looking at that one slide, growing vertically. So utilizing trellises or training plants up in some manner really helps. So staking, caging, all sorts of things work great. Again, going vertical, you're minimizing the square footage on the ground. You're often making it easier to harvest things. Often you're getting better airflow on plants. And when you have more airflow, that means less leaf wetness, for instance, and wet leaves lead to more disease. So anytime we can have drier plants, that's happy for us. and it's happy for the plants. So again, staking tomatoes, using cages for tomatoes, having, things for beans to climb up, peas as well. We can even have cucumbers on trellising as well. Squashes, gourds are a great one to put on a trellis or on a fence row, for instance. So anytime we can go upwards, we're going to benefit ourselves. So these are just a few quick examples. For instance, we have the bean poles or bamboo or river cane poles there on the left. They actually have beans planted down the bottom. I know the picture's small, you can't tell that. This also is one where they're doing some interplanting because immediately outside of the beans, they have some leaf lettuces growing. And they're probably winding down because as it gets hotter and the beans are happy, that lettuce won't be. So that's, again, a scenario where as one crop fades, another one is taking over the area. In the center is where I offer my caution against your homeowners association. I will not come to your rescue. You are welcome to use a canoe as a planting container as well as a bed spring, but I cannot get you out of trouble with spouses or homeowners associations. I did not include the picture of a petunia in a toilet in the front yard, but that's another interesting one. That's a possibility too. But certainly, and then on the right, we have concrete reinforcing wire, which is great to use as tomato cages. It's pretty long lasting. It's not real expensive. It's rusty looking, so maybe the aesthetics aren't there, but just tell them it's rustic and they'll go along with it. What's important, I think the one on the left, the bamboo there, I think that's going to fail miserably. When you get those beans growing up and they get the full weight on there, I think that will topple over. You need a lot of support. You're talking about a lot of biomass with beans, particularly even the tomatoes. If you've got indeterminate tomatoes, which indeterminate tomatoes just keep growing and growing as long as there's a season, they're the ones that overgrow and take over the plants beside them. Nothing wrong with planting them. They're great to grow, but they produce a huge amount of plant. And so have those rebar cages well staked. A T-post, which is a fencing post, if you're not familiar with those, are not at all an over estimation of what's needed. I can't tell what kind of posts they have there, but they look kind of small to me. If you have big tomatoes, you can see those topple over, and I've seen it happen. So make sure you've got enough physical support to support things if you do go vertical, because things do get heavy in a hurry. That's not a bad thing. That means we've got a lot of plant there, and that plant is producing what we want. And speaking of hillsides, we can also do some terracing. And terracing is just the stair stepping. This is actually a picture from a Peruvian island. They've got hills there too. So at the end of the day, actually doing this, and we can do this on a very small scale, but it's done on a large scale for agriculture. And particularly when we have a garden area, lots of times we'll see smaller plants that are terraced into areas that we might otherwise not be able to use because of their slope. But because we can do this terracing, we can actually utilize it. So again, it's not that we can't plant on slopes. We just have to be maybe a little deliberate in our actions with it. Containers, absolutely nothing wrong with growing in containers. I encourage you to use a commercial potting mix. Certainly there are recipes out there. I would not take soil from the ground and put it in a container. We're changing it, and it's not going to perform well for us. It's not going to do well whenever we remove it from the ground. So I encourage you to use commercial mixes or mix your own. I honestly don't know that you would ever have a scenario where you're going to save money by mixing your own. So I think most of the time buying as large of potting mix that you can, so not buying small bags, buying the biggest one, or even a compressed bale that's sometimes available to us is probably the most cost efficient way of doing that. If you're using very large containers and you're not planting very large plants in it, you can actually fill up some of the volume with something like packing peanuts or milk jugs or cell pack, anything that can take up physical space. So if you've got, a container that is 36 inches deep, you really probably don't need that for any of our vegetables. 12 to 15 inches will probably get us by with most things. Now, if we were deeper, you're probably going to be watering less, but certainly, 15 inches will be suitable for a lot of plants. And so that's where we can take up some of that volume as something inert. something that's not going to break down on us, and it actually would limit our cost to fill that container. It also can mean the container is lighter weight, which sometimes is important if it's something we want to move later. So we don't have to necessarily dig it out to empty it and move it. One thing I want to stress with containers, do not add gravel or rocks to the bottom of container to improve drainage in that container. You will not improve drainage. In fact, when you change pore space, when you create distinct layers, it's going to slow the flow of water. It's not going to improve it. So don't add gravel to the bottom of any container ever to improve drainage. If you need to ballast a container, if you need to keep it right side up because you've got a tall plant in there or something like that, there are reasons to put gravel in the bottom of a container, but not for drainage improvement, or it would never be for that purpose.
For the purpose of the soil, is a container the same as a raised bed, or are we talking like small stuff?
So in that instance, I'm referencing containers being something smaller. So yeah, so it wouldn't necessarily be a raised bed per se. It would be more like a several gallon or a few gallon container. Something like leaf lettuce, we can put in a very small container with very little volume and it do well because it's not a huge plant. Something like tomatoes, 5 gallons may be about a minimum of volume that we want in there. And even then, I'm going to try to limit the size of tomato I'm putting in that container too. So we do want to match plants with the size of container that we have. I mentioned earlier irrigation. If we look over kind of like an average of the season, basically vegetables are needing about 1 inch of water per week. You probably realize you don't reliably get necessarily 1 inch per week, and that's where the soil storage comes into play. And certainly when plants are smaller, they use less. When they're larger, when they're setting fruit, filling fruit, they use more. So a rain gauge could be a useful tool, but I don't think it's something that's necessary at all. I don't like moisture meters or anything like that you can buy. I don't think they're accurate. I think you've got the most sophisticated moisture meter that you need to buy, and that's just your finger. Dry it off and stick your finger in the soil, and that's going to let you know if it's wet or not. And you'll learn more from that than utilizing a soil moisture meter that may or may not function properly. Even commercially, there are some tools to measure soil moisture, but you got to be careful how they're used to make sure they're used correctly. So a lot of growers just honestly pull back plastic and check the soil. It's more reliable. I really like soaker hoses or drip tape or things like that in the garden because I want to water the soil and not the plant. I don't want leaf wetness. So if I can avoid that, good. So sprinklers, you can use them, but I wouldn't encourage it necessarily. If you do use something, particularly if it's wetting that plant, do it earlier in the day. So it has all day to dry off with the sun. And sometimes people say, well, if I water and the sun comes out, then I'll burn holes in the leaves. No, you will not. The shape's wrong. You're never going to get a concentration of sunlight through a water droplet on a plant. If you did, the rainforest would have a bunch of holy plants, if you think about it, because they get rain a lot more frequently than we do. Again, it's worthwhile to think about these things, but at the end of the day, water is a great tool to have available to your plants. You will have more success if you can water than if you cannot. Weed control, at the end of the day, mechanical is where it's at. And lots of times on a smaller scale, hand is probably the best option. I do encourage mulching, if for no other reason, which mulching is great for many reasons, but weed control. When you have mulch on the ground, you'll have fewer weeds germinating, and those that do are going to be easier to pull up. So I love having organic mulches on the ground. There are some herbicides that can be used in garden scenarios. Lots of times we're using those before we're actually planting. So we're doing like a burn down treatment. There are some pre-emergents that can prevent germination. So that can prevent seed germination of your weeds. Though they could also prevent germination of seeds you're trying to plant there. So be aware if you are utilizing those, read the labels fully. Always remember the label is the law when it comes to any sort of pesticide product, and make sure that you use it according to those directions. You do want to try to keep weeds from going to seed, because when they go to seed, you're going to have years and years and years of future weeds now. So anytime, even if your garden's winding down and you've got weeds growing, go ahead and go in there, do some mowing, use a string trimmer, cut them out by hand, whatever, because you don't want them going to seed, because that's going to be more problems later. It's great if you can keep border areas somewhat controlled as well with mowing or string trimmers. We're not talking about manicured, just not letting those plants go to seed. Don't let them flower and go to seed. If we interrupt that, doing it a few to 3 or 4 times a season, that can help reduce seed coming into our garden from outside. If we're utilizing compost, particularly with manures, make sure they are well composted, because there are seeds that can survive the digestive tract easily. But if compost is well made and it reaches high enough temperature, that will kill those seeds. So make sure it is well composted. Mulching, it controls weeds, it conserves soil moisture, it reduces erosion, it keeps vegetables cleaner. And there's actually some diseases that we find are coming out of our soil. And so if we reduce soil splash onto the plant, we can actually reduce disease pressure. I like organic type mulches. And again, that's just stuff that used to be living. So compost, leaves, straw. We can't even use paper products like newspaper. The synthetics have their place, plastics or the landscape fabrics. The reason I don't like them as much, they're not doing anything else. They're not building that soil organic matter. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with using them. Obviously, they work great. It is the way, plastic mulches is the industry standard for vegetable production. We can get great production, but at the end of the day, with a lot of home gardens, it's not maximum production, I think, that we're worried about. So I like the organic mulches, which still give us all the benefits, and then also are helping our soil biological community and all that. So I love mulches in the garden. Because I really haven't talked much about pest control to this point, I think it's worth mentioning before we are wrapping up here. Integrated pest management, or IPM, you'll hear it a lot in agriculture circles. Basically, it's just approaching pest control with all tools possible and not just immediately thinking about a chemical control option. Because certainly there are some pests that's going to be the best option we have, and it's going to be necessary. But we can do a lot of things before we reach that point. Simple things like hygiene. So don't bring problems into the garden. Make sure we're bringing in healthy plants, weed-free, soil amendments, things like that. Rotation of crop families. Again, I've got a presentation on YouTube that is about planting your vegetable garden. It goes into more depth if you want to know more about that. Building soil health, because when we have healthy soil, we have healthy plants, and healthy plants resist pests. And we want to use pest-resistant varieties. So we have some varieties on the market that are absolutely great. Typically, these are our hybrid varieties. That's not to say some of our heirlooms don't have good resistance, but these hybrids are specifically bred and chosen oftentimes for those traits. So I like planting a mix of both heirloom or open pollinated plants as well as hybrids, because they all have their different strengths. So I wouldn't exclude either from my garden. And obviously we want to make sure we water and fertilize appropriately, because again, happy plants are healthy plants, and that's only a good thing. So with that, let me mention cover crops. Again, when we've got bare soil, we've got conditions that we need to change. Bare soil is not good for our garden. There's kind of an old methodology to gardens where folks will plow in the fall, leave it bare all winter. Believe it or not, bare soil actually will have less water infiltrating into it than soil with plants on it, because you get more sheeting action, you get crusting on that soil, and so you actually get less water in there than if you have plants sitting there actually using some of the water. So never have bare soil in our gardens if we can avoid it. So cover crops in the fall are a great way to do that. Plant those late summer, early fall. It protects from erosion, adds organic matter, competes with weeds, Can add nitrogen if we're using a legume. So if we're doing something like an Austrian winter pea or vetch or things like that, we can actually add nitrogen because we're using a legume that works with the rhizobium bacteria to fix nitrogen from the air. So that's reducing the fertilizer we're buying. It also functions as a rotation crop. It's probably not as good as a true rotation, but at least is a break in the cycle. And so that can be helpful for presenting the buildup of diseases and insects in our garden. So cover crops are good. You're going to get an email, has a ton of resources on it. There's a lot of them in there. Again, these are focused on Northeast Tennessee. We had a lot of folks sign up from around the US. I'm happy to have you this evening, but the timing of things is really going to be focused on Northeast Tennessee. So just be aware of that, kind of the southern Midlands of the Appalachian Mountains. One of the ones I want to highlight particularly is in the upper left. It's the home garden variety trials. They've not yet, to my knowledge, published the 22 results yet. But basically, they have a program where they have gardeners across Tennessee trial different varieties. And typically, you get 2 different varieties and basically say, which do you like better? What's the strong points of each? And so based on those results, and again, these are home gardeners doing it, not university, grad students. We have recommended varieties for across Tennessee. And so I think you'll find that interesting. If you're overwhelmed on what might I try from a seed catalog, take a look at that. It'll at least give you some pointers on some you might. Yes.
There was a presentation on that about 2 weeks ago. It's available on YouTube.
Oh, it's available on YouTube. Okay, interesting. Well, good. Because the PDF link that they have, it says 2022. Okay, then maybe that link will hopefully, maybe I need to empty my cache or something like that. That sounds internety enough. That might be right. Because mine still pops up the 2021 results, which is still good information. It's just that there's another year that should have been released, and I thought it was, but the link I have isn't doing it. It's off the UT Hort website, which is actually the next slide. Yeah. Well, and so again, a lot of different resources on there. Some of them are broad, some of them very crop specific, like you see there on the screen. So dig through those resources as well as take a look at this site. This is uthort.com. And then you click on the educational resources tab at the top. You see this page here. They have it categorized by horticultural categories. It's not just vegetables. It's not just fruits. It's turf and everything in between. So this is everything horticulture, great resource. Most materials I send to people can be found on this site. That doesn't mean not to holler at me or ask questions. That's why I'm here. But you'll find a tremendous number of great resources here. And this is actually a link to the PDF that you have, that you will have emailed to you after this is over. So there is the actual link as well. In the last class we did, some of the feedback was include the URL for folks that don't like doing things on smartphones, for instance. So I made sure to take care of that. The printed version doesn't have the link because I printed it before I read through the reviews. So please add that yourself, but there's a tiny URL there, so it's easier and not forever long for you. Or you can use your smartphone or other device and go straight to it as well and download that PDF. But again, you'll see a ton of resources, most from UT, but there's also some from surrounding universities. Particularly, there's some IPM or integrated pest management materials from University of Kentucky that I really enjoy because they have great pictures. It shows not only pest damage and diseases, but also environmental problems like different nutritional disorders and things like that can sometimes be confused with true pest. So lastly, what I'd like to remind people, and this I feel strongly about, I do believe gardening is a skill and not a gift. I think some people may be better at any given thing than others, but I do think everybody can be a successful gardener. I think you can grow a garden, and I think you need to make sure you have fun. When it becomes too much like work, you're probably not going to enjoy it. And so I think have some fun with it, plant something unusual, plant something different, plant something that may not make it just because you want to. That's okay. Not everything has to be about production and maximization of yields. And lastly, a small garden, well-maintained, out-yields a large garden, poorly maintained. A few tomato plants that you actually love and care for is better than a field that you don't. And so at the end of the day, don't let your eyes get too big when you look at the seed catalog. Plant just a few plants of different varieties rather than the whole packet at once. And so with that, I will yield to questions.